Namaskar and welcome to our weekly program on geoeconomics. Now, China's 2024 parliamentary meeting is being held from March the 5th to the 11th, 2024. Now, the two sessions are concurrently taking place. They're the annual meetings of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, that's the CPPCC, and the National People's Congress, or the NPC. Now, for the sake of simplicity, we'll just refer to them as the Chinese Parliament. Now, on March the 5th, the Premier Li Qiang had said that the economy would grow at 5% and that the government's overall approach on the economy is going to be the same. On the 6th of March, the chairman of the Securities Regulatory Commission, along with the country's finance and commerce ministers, made a few suggestions. And these include improving the quality of listed companies with more frequent and larger scale checks on these companies. And they also suggested urbanization, which is the key to China's economic progress since it increases consumption and it also brings in trillions of yuan in new investments. They're going to build new supply chains for mid-priced goods, and they're going to also improve e-commerce regulations. Now, the finance minister of China said that the government will keep its belts tightened. They're going to use their resources in a more focused manner. And the monetary policies of that country are going to create predictable environment for keeping the prices stable. So while all these suggestions sound appropriate, let's discuss how much impact they're going to have. So joining us in this discussion are Prasenjit K. Basu, who's the chief economist of ICICI Securities, and Sriram Srirangam, who is an economist. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. Mr. Basu, let me start with you now. The Chinese authorities are looking for stable growth. Is that even possible without major reforms in the current times? Is there enough trust for new investments to come in?
Well, I think the short answer is no. I don't think they're going to achieve 5% growth. Because they have a massive overhang of unsold property. The vacancy rates in urban China are around 20%, which is far more than Japan had at the height of its property bubble. Vacancy rates in Japan peaked at 9%. In China, across 70 cities, vacancy rates are around 20%. And there is absolutely no confidence among the final buyers of property. And so there's this huge property overhang. On top of that, there's overcapacity in almost every industry: steel, aluminium, solar panels, semiconductors. Wherever you look, China has built excess capacity. In the past, they would try to export the export capacity they would try to get rid of that excess capacity by exporting more to the rest of the world and selling it at below cost.
Right.
That, of course, is classically called dumping in international trade. And most countries are taking actions to curtail China's dumping. So China basically has no real options now. It can't really do what it normally used to do in the past. It has antagonized too many other countries. It can export primarily to Russia and to Southeast Asia. Most others are resisting the dumping of Chinese products. And so, I think it's going to be very difficult for China to achieve 5% growth.
Sure.
They're trying to boost consumption. But all these measures, these so-called reforms, are really, not going to have a significant medium-term impact.
Okay, Mr. Srirangam, analysts are saying that these are goals. The goals look good in isolation, but that's what they are. They're just more goals. They're not spelt out actually how they're going to achieve these goals. What do you think? I mean, given what Mr. Basu said, these goals are going to be pretty tough to achieve.
China is facing a polycrisis within itself. The world is also facing a polycrisis. And, be it COVID-1, COVID-2, the geopolitics, geoeconomics. And, one of the most important factors which could be different this time around is that there is political suspicion of big capital. That is, they're not allowing people like Alibaba and Tencent to come up, which was not the case earlier. They could bounce back in 2013 and they were hardly touched by the Lehman crisis. Now, Jack Ma is teaching in Japan. He is the head of a multinational that made China what it is. So political distrust of big capital, Chinese MNC is number one. Ideological purity or whatever else you may call it, number two. And personal authority jealously being guarded off, the leader, point number three. Plus, of course, the geopolitics and so on and so forth. And add to that, the social factor, the demographic disadvantage which is cropping up now, average mean age being 39 years. So these factors are not, stuff that can be overcome so easily. But then, what we've learned over the last 20 years is never write off China. Yes. 5 is not too much. 5% is not too much. Yes, the base is higher. Last year, they grew at 5.2. But as my fellow panelist touched upon it, the property crisis, the local self-government that is in big debt crisis, add to that the huge consumption challenge they have, not being able to export, not all that adds up to a story which could be different, but never write off China.
Okay, Mr. Basu, China has been increasing its defense spending in line with its growth, and now it's second only to the United States. Do you think excessive spending on defense has slowed the economy a bit?
Well, I don't think so. Spending on defense often has technological spin-offs, and China, if anything, has done very well in many of the defense-related technologies, and is creating an ecosystem that is independent of the United States and is closely collaborating with Russia. But it's interesting that Russia recently undertook a war game scenario for nuclear war, and the enemy that the war game was aimed at was China, not the United States. So I think it is, the relationship between China and Russia is an intriguing one. It's a mysterious one, and it's enigmatic. At the moment, Russia is the major source of demand for Chinese exports. There's been a massive increase in China's exports to the US. Almost all the cars sold in Russia last year were Chinese cars.
Right.
So, the rest of the world has withdrawn from the Russian market. China has stormed in.
Right.
But that is the only trading partner that China really has of significance in the world at the moment that is happy to trade and grow its trade with China. But in terms of defense, I don't think that focusing on defense, particularly focusing on import substitution and building up defense capabilities, is necessarily a bad thing for an economy. Of course, if you spend far too much, if defense spending is growing much faster than GDP, as it is actually in China. China is planning to increase defense spending by 7.2% in real terms.
Yes.
Which means that they are basically increasing the threat that they represent to the rest of the world, including India. I mean, as a neighboring country,
right.
And a country that is is not on the most peaceful terms with China at the moment. We have to be concerned that China is increasing its defense spending so aggressively.
Sure. We'll return to this a little later. But Mr. Srirangam, China is talking of promoting more urbanization. But there already is that, as both of you mentioned, that massive real estate problem. Are they expecting, new investments to come into real estate? Is that even possible?
Real estate, you see, the housing multiplier has run out of steam in China. As it happens everywhere else, wherever you depended upon housing to boost growth, it did for decades, and now it's no longer able to, because of the bad name it got, because of Evergrande, etc. So that could even bring about financial instability that has wiped out the savings, that has dampened the sentiment. So real estate, again, being banked upon to revive the economy, the urban economy, that is virtually ruled out. That is virtually ruled out in the a horizon of about say 5 years. How else will they boost urbanization? There is productivity threat to employment there. Yes, the dummy parliament said that 12 million jobs we want to create in the urban areas. 22% is the youth unemployment there. So infrastructure is already saturated. So where do you get growth in the urban areas? Wrong place to look for growth. You should go for rural areas. Local government can't spend. Financial instability looming. Savings wiped out. Young people are in a queue for jobs which are not there. And so, a little bit of stock market, boosting because you are stopping sales, whatever. Industrialization is, as my fellow panelists pointed out, excess of capacity built up, nowhere to sell, dumping not allowed anywhere. So this revival of urban growth looks, a bit sort of like a mirage.
All right. Sure. Mr. Basu, currently there is a problem, as Mr. Srirangam says, with youth unemployment. There's massive exploitation also taking place for those who are employed. They have this 996 that's working from 9 o'clock to 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. And college graduates don't consider this fair at all. How serious is this resentment, in terms of impact perhaps on the political class?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there is a serious problem with the amount of hours required. But now they're not able to generate jobs. Now that the economy isn't growing that much, it is becoming much more of a challenge to generate jobs. So you have 22% unemployment for youth. That is a new problem that China faces. Now, what is also, I think, a challenge is really the financial system. The financial system, you've not only got Evergrande now being liquidated. It's gone beyond bankruptcy. It declared bankruptcy in the US early last year. By the end of last year, Hong Kong's courts ordered the liquidation of Evergrande, which used to be the largest property developer in China. Currently, the largest property developer is Country Garden, and Country Garden is also on the verge of bankruptcy. Zhongji is the largest shadow banking group. You can call it the equivalent of an NBFC in India. And it's a humongous group, and it's unable to pay its liabilities. So when depositors or pseudo depositors in Zhongji Group wanted to take their money out as their deposits matured, they found they could not take the money out. So there is a serious domestic financial sector crisis that is spreading.
Okay.
On top of that, defaults turns out to have China as their largest creditor. It's already happened with the 3 defaulting countries so far. You've had Sri Lanka, Zambia, and Ethiopia defaulting. And it turns out that the largest creditor was China. There are about 50 other frontier economies that are, in danger of defaulting, and China will be the most exposed. So the banking system is being gradually debilitated. And I'd say this is very akin to Japan in 97, 98, when the Asian financial crisis happened.
Right.
The Japanese banks, all the 5 Asian financial countries had Japan as the largest creditor. This is exactly now the situation with the 53, risky frontier economies, all of whom have China as their largest
exposed to Chinese debt. Mr. Srirangam, there is a problem with the pull factor. I mean, that's demand. Consumption is not increasing, and the Parliament of China seems to have realized that. And there is a plan now to increase farmers' pensions. Looks like, how effective is this going to be? It's really pushing rural demand when they're talking about urbanization.
That's piecemeal. Come to think of why consumption has crashed, why demand has crashed. all the factors we have listed, all of them are conspiring together to pull down the demand, pull down consumption. You're not able to export, and through BRI, you try to do some business, and all of them caught on that they are being trapped into debt. And so exports have come down. Your domestic growth has suffered, COVID-1, COVID-2, and FDI is not to the same level like it was because of, China plus one, de-risk, decouple, whatever you like to call. So investment suffered. Locals are not spending too much. Banks are not lending. Consumers are suspicious of the economy and the future. Sentiment has taken a back seat. Put all these things together, what do you have? You have deflation because of crashing of demand. So with raising the pension of farmer and the old people, if you think you can pull through, growth of 5%, then I think you're not really on ground. And fiscal stimulus, subsidization, they have announced outside the budget some $1 trillion or some amount, large amount. The ultra long-term bonds through which they want to raise money. For what? They want to stimulate the economy a little bit. But then the structural overload on the economy is such that these piecemeal measures are unlikely to have any impact. They try to talk up the investors like Apple and others.
Yes.
Xi Jinping has done it. But most unlikely that anyone will look at China like they did before. India is emerging, Vietnam is emerging. And so the stock of China is not same as it was. And maybe for the first time in the last 40 years, it is something we need to sit up to.
Well, perhaps except for Russia. But Mr. Basu, they have been trying to boost manufacturing up the value chain, increasing the production of high-end products. Huawei, for instance, they claim is increasing its footprint. It's competing with Apple and things like that. So how effective is this, in creating jobs for, let's say, aspirational youth?
Well, again, you need an outlet. If Huawei is going to succeed, it needs markets outside China. Of course, the China market itself is large, and it's possible that Huawei will gain some market share domestically. But aspirational youth all over the world want to buy an Apple iPhone. They don't want to buy a Huawei. I mean, even in China, Huawei phones are mid-market or, at the bottom of the market. So an aspirational youth person would actually much prefer to buy or aspire to buy an Apple iPhone. Now, at the margins, Huawei, etc., may gain market share at Apple's expense, but Apple still has a strong domestic presence in China, and of course, globally, its presence remains very strong. And what is interesting, of course, is that Apple's incremental production is increasingly be done in India. The iPhone 16 will begin with maybe 1/4 or maybe as much as 1/3 of its production being done in India, which is a huge shift from the past. Until 2 or 3 years ago, almost all of the suppliers of Apple, the likes of Foxconn, Wistron, Pegatron, almost all of their manufacturing facilities were in China. Incrementally, those facilities are moving to India in particular, some to Vietnam, and there's less and less of a focus on China. So China is trying to actually make life difficult for Foxconn. I mean, it's putting a lot of political pressure on Foxconn. But if anything, that is only accelerating this process.
Right.
And the cost advantages of India are beginning to be felt.
Right.
Of course, when you start manufacturing, there will be defects. The defect ratios are still quite high in India. But now that we are into the second and third year of significant production of iPhones and their accessories and their components.
Right. So we improve with each cycle, definitely.
Is picking up, and you're beginning to see a shift.
Mr. Srirangam, some analysts, including Mr. Basu, have just said that China is headed towards the Japan-like stagnation. So, China is a much larger country in terms of population. Do you think that it's stagnating because of poor economic management rather than the law of diminishing returns?
No, the stagnation could, 5% is not stagnation.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
But for China, by the standards China set for decades together, 5 is a letdown. And when you hear the headline that China is ambitious at the growth target at 5%, then you are in a separate world altogether, a new world, in which how long is China going to stagnate? I think China is in for trouble from multiple fronts, without taking a note of climate change, etc. Geopolitics, geoeconomics, domestic politics, all this trying to divert the attention of the people, foreign policy angle, be it Taiwan, be it, Ladakh, etc. So when you can't give goods and services, you give them emotions. And the hubris of China, the dictatorship of China, all this is going to cinch them on a relatively long basis. At least this is what my naivety tells me, because earlier times it was proved to be naivety. Okay. Will this be different now? Will it be a long drawn out stagnation? We really don't know. But 5 itself is ambition. Which world are we in?
5 is a claim. I mean, we're not sure whether they're going to reach that target. But Mr. Basu, China's central government debt was 23.8% of GDP. But its municipalities have a debt of, 80% of their domestic product. So how serious is this issue? I mean, you talked about other countries exposed to China's money. Their own states are, or their own municipalities are. Yeah.
Yeah, actually the basic problem with the municipal governments is that they have always depended on selling land as a major source of revenue. So that source is no longer going to be available now that land prices are falling. So, as land prices begin to fall, then the local governments get into more and more trouble. And the local governments have also put out something called local government financing vehicles, which are dependent on land sales as well. So this method of raising revenue through land sales is has run out of road.
Okay.
And consequently, China basically has a multiplicity of problems that are going to hold back growth. Now, It's quite possible that this year they will do something like 4%. But over the medium term, growth is going to be decelerating. It'll get to 3, then 2. And then like Japan over the last 20 years, I think China is going to face a prolonged period of near stagnation. Now, It's important to understand that real GDP in Japan was still growing about a little over 1% during this long period of so-called Japanification. Real GDP was growing, nominal GDP wasn't because prices were falling. So they had a serious problem of deflation. They had very little nominal GDP growth for about 15 years. But real GDP was still growing a little over 1%.
Sure.
And was in recent years in Japan, the population was declining, so per capita GDP in real terms was actually growing a fair bit. Anyway, now that ironically, Japan now is getting out of Japanification. Last year, they had nearly 3% CPI inflation. China is entering Japanification. It has deflation, CPI and PPI deflation. Now, PPI deflation has occurred for about 1/3 of the time over the last 25 years. But now CPI, the consumer prices are also falling.
Yes.
When you have deflation, then people start postponing their consumption and investment decisions. And that becomes a sort of a vicious circle.
All right. We have very little time left, so let me get the last word in from Mr. Srirangam. China's forex reserves are the highest in the world at $3.22 trillion. Now, are they utilizing these reserves adequately? I mean, they can clearly afford a stimulus, or is that unwise?
But stimulus is a possibility even otherwise. Forex resources have nothing to do with stimulus.
I mean, it's a cushion.
How long? How long will you stimulate? You have to use your money to fund your local government, out of their debt crisis. You have to subsidize the consumption. And, for all that, you require money. But forex reserves, you do, what you require them for? You require them for import and defend your currency. Surely, if there's a run on your currency, surely if there is a countering of Chinese economy by the rest of the world, because they're all waiting for a chance, because you are an aggressive country, not a wanted country, then you can use your $3.2 trillion worth of forex and survive another day.
Right. So we've really run short of time. But a last word from you, Mr. Basu. Does China's aggressive stance, on the trade routes, we talked about their defense expenditure, is it counterproductive?
Yeah, you mean you're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and so on.
I'm talking about their postures on the South China Sea and trying to say that all these routes are theirs.
Oh, no, those are not, that's not trade. That is imperialism. That is imperialism of the high seas. They have the so-called 9-dash line that more or less claims that the whole of the South China Sea belongs to them. That's nonsense. But the ASEAN countries have not been able to resist together. The Philippines, which is facing the most severe threat there, is aligning strongly with the United States and with India, trying to import some of our submarines and so on to counter
my producer tells me we'll have to leave it there. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Srirangam and Mr. Basu. Thank you for throwing light on China's economy at the current time. Well, the Chinese government is actively promoting the registration of rural workers into urban areas. They're wanting to urbanize, as we said. And the U.S. export controls on tech-related industries such as semiconductors has strongly impacted the industry investments and the growth prospects. So the Chinese growth target of 5%, some consider this ambitious. But the world markets act as a barometer, and they were not enthused by the Chinese numbers. Thanks very much for watching. Namaskar.